Under a crumbling stretch of coastline in Fife, on the east side of Scotland, something was working its way out of the sand that nobody had gone looking for. For more than 1,000 years, the world has been handed the same story about the Picts, a painted people who cut unreadable symbols into rock, held Rome at the edge of its own empire, then went off the map without explanation. That story had already been broken once, in a genetics lab, in 2023. The ground was about to break it a second time and expose how little of the official version had ever been checked. Rome handed these people their name almost 1,800 years ago, Picti, the painted ones, and the world repeated it, century after century, without once asking whether the word was true. Nobody checked. Not until a winter storm tore into this coastline, and a site warden named Stuart Cook walked down to see what was left of it. What was standing out of the eroded sand was not driftwood, it was a human skull. And the date that came back on that skull did not belong to the story anybody was telling. The skull surfaced in early December 2023, after the storms, directly in front of the most important stretch of Pictish rock art anywhere in Scotland, the Wemyss Caves. The name is a clue on its own. Wemyss is pronounced Wemyss, from the Gaelic word uaimh, which simply means cave. Further along the coast, Pittenweem carries the same element, place of the cave. There were 11 caves here, or close to it. 6 are left: Court Cave, Dew Cave, Well Cave, Jonathan's Cave, Sliding Cave, Gasworks Cave. Inside them are Pictish symbols in a concentration found nowhere else in Britain, a double disc, a creature nobody has ever identified, known only as the Pictish beast. And on the north wall of Jonathan's Cave, a 6-oared boat, probably the oldest image of a boat anywhere in Scotland. Here is the first correction worth making, and it is not the one usually made. Those symbols were not painted. They were cut, deeply and deliberately, into rock that has now outlasted the people who made them. And the word Picti was never about walls in the first place. It describes bodies. It appears first in a Roman speech of praise written in the year 297, and it means painted or tattooed. Whether these people actually painted themselves is a separate argument, and it is not settled. There is no eyewitness account of it. Woad, the dye everybody reaches for, performs badly as body paint and worse as tattoo ink. So the name may be describing something nobody ever saw. That is not trivia. It means the first fact the world inherited about this people was written down by the empire fighting them, in a speech designed to flatter an emperor. For centuries that Roman word was almost all anyone had. No texts in their own hand, no decoded language. A wall of symbols nobody could read, and a silence where the people should have been. Historians filled that silence with legend, an exotic tribe from somewhere far to the east, Scythia, according to the medieval monk Bede, writing 3 centuries after the fact, and repeating a story he had not witnessed. Then the ground in front of Wemyss gave up a body. Stuart Cook was not the first to find bones on this shoreline. At least 5 sets of human remains have come out of this coast since the 1980s, the most recent in 1988 and 1993. Those dated to around the 11th century, medieval, when carvers were still working these walls. Then a second, far more complete skeleton turned up beside the skull. It lay directly on bedrock, folded into a tight crouch, covered over with a layer of stones. The assumption was the obvious one. Another burial from the same medieval shoreline. Scape expected exactly that. AOC Archaeology moved in to excavate, Historic Environment Scotland was brought in, and samples went away for radiocarbon and isotope analysis. But the crouch would not sit still in anybody's head. A medieval burial lies extended, straight, hands folded facing east. This body had been closed in on itself and weighed down with stone, in a shape archaeologists associate with something a great deal older. Nobody had an explanation. Only a strange detail, and a weight. While that weight ran on, a much larger crack had already opened somewhere else entirely. Not on a beach, inside a genetics laboratory. On the 27th of April 2023, a team led by Dr. Adeline Morez of Liverpool John Moores University, working with Dr. Linus Girdland Flink at the University of Aberdeen, published results in the journal PLOS Genetics. The study went directly at the Scythian legend. They sequenced 2 high-quality genomes from Pictish-era burials, one from the cemetery at Lundin Links in Fife, one from Ballantor in Easter Ross. Then they set those genomes against thousands of ancient and modern samples. The result was not ambiguous. These men were not steppe nomads. Their ancestry came from the Iron Age population already living in Britain, local, continuous, ordinary, in the most disruptive possible sense. That is not a footnote being corrected. It is evidence that the exotic vanished tribe the world had been sold for 1,500 years never existed at all. The paper went further. The Pictish genomes sat closer to people living today in Western Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, and in Northumbria than to people in southern England. The Picts did not disappear. A great many of them carried on living, under a different name, in the same part of the country. That should have closed the question. It mostly did. Except the whole finding rested on 2 genomes, from 2 men, from cemeteries 160 kilometers apart. Enough to break a legend, not enough to close a file. And back on the Fife coast, a skull was still waiting on its own answer. It came in 2025. The Save Wemyss Ancient Cave Society announced the radiocarbon results. Not medieval, not close. The remains eroding out of the shore in front of the caves dated to somewhere between 750 and 800 BC, the early Iron Age, roughly 18 centuries older than anyone assumed when the bones came out of the sand. The Society's chair called it a find of national historic importance, and it is not difficult to see why. This is evidence that the coast mattered to somebody long before there were Picts here to claim it, before a single symbol was cut into that rock. Before Rome had sent one soldier north to give this land's people a name, so the mystery did not close. It flipped. The real question was never only who the Picts were. The genetics had largely answered that. Indigenous, local, continuous. The deeper question became this. Why does one narrow stretch of coast, one cluster of caves, keep drawing people back across nearly 3,000 years? Iron Age bodies laid into the shore around 800 BC. Pictish carvers working the same rock 1,000 years later. Medieval burials along the same waterline centuries after that. Perhaps it was simply useful ground. Shelter, fresh water, a high tide line, defensible stone. Or perhaps something about this place carried a meaning that outlasted the people who first gave it one. Nobody can prove which. It is a strange thing to keep calling a coincidence. And the story only gets harder once it leaves the shoreline. For a long time, a second insult ran alongside the first. Primitive people, isolated at the edge of the known world, scratching pictures onto rocks. The village of Riney in Aberdeenshire took that apart. It began with a farmer named Kevin Alston, who turned up a carved stone in his field in 1978, showing an axe-wielding figure with bared teeth. The Riney Man. Between 2011 and 2017, excavations led by Professor Gordon Noble of the University of Aberdeen worked the ground around the Crosstane at Barflat Farm. What came out of that soil was not the edge of anything. Shards of late Roman wine amphorae, shipped from the eastern Mediterranean. Glass drinking beakers imported from France. One of the largest assemblages of early medieval metalworking anywhere in Britain, inside a settlement ringed by ditches, banks, and an oak wall. And above the village, on the hill called Tap o' Noth, radiocarbon dating and aerial survey found traces of more than 800 huts. Thousands of people on a hilltop, in a country that was supposed to be empty. People too remote to matter were drinking Mediterranean wine out of French glass. Further north on the Moray coast, Burghead is the largest Pictish fort ever identified, and it was long written off as destroyed by 19th century town building. Excavations led from Aberdeen since 2015 found that assumption was wrong too. Under the modern town were intact floor levels of Pictish longhouses, massive ramparts, and a coin minted under Alfred the Great. And on the final day of the 2024 season, a volunteer named John Ralph, a retired engineer, lifted a kite-shaped bronze ring set with a red garnet out of the ground. 1,000 years in the soil found in the last hours of a dig by a man who does this in his own time. Even objects long filed as Pictish are being quietly rewritten. The Norreys Law hoard, dug out of a mound in Fife in 1819, includes a leaf-shaped silver plaque carrying the same double disc and Z-rod carved on the walls at Wemyss. Recent work at National Museum Scotland has redated parts of that hoard, and a good deal of it turns out to be late Roman silver, cut up and put back to use. That is a museum label admitting, very quietly, that it may have been wrong for the better part of 2 centuries. If the objects keep forcing revisions, the caves save the worst of it for last. 200 kilometers north of Wemyss, on the Moray Firth at Covesea, sits the Sculptor's Cave. It is one of very few places in Scotland where Pictish symbols were cut directly into a cave. a fish, a crescent and V-rod, a pentacle. They cluster around the entrance passages and go no deeper, as though whatever this place was needed marking at the threshold, and not inside. Sylvia Benton excavated it in 1928, pulling out late Bronze Age gold hair rings, a hoard of Roman coins, and human remains. Most of what she recovered is now lost. Decades later, a team led by Professor Ian Armitt ran modern radiocarbon dating on what survived. The results split the cave's history into two chapters, roughly 1,000 years apart. In the late Bronze Age, between the 12th and 10th centuries BC, the bodies of children were brought into this cave. Some appear to have been bundled and adorned with gold and bronze jewelry and laid near the entrance. Then, in the Roman Iron Age, people were killed inside it, at least 6 individuals. Their neck vertebrae carry cut marks made from behind, consistent with decapitation while kneeling. One neck was taken through in a single stroke. Another shows repeated separate cuts. Ian Armitt and Lindsay Booster published the full account in 2020 in a book called Darkness Visible through the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. Their reading is that these were executions, staged in a place that already held ritual importance, at a time of rapid political change. Nobody knows exactly why. The explanations run from sacrifice, to public punishment, to violence tied to Rome's shifting frontier. None of it is proven. All of it sits directly beneath carvings placed at the threshold, facing whoever walked in. The carvings raise a fight of their own. For decades, the assumption was that the Pictish symbol system belonged to the 6th and 7th centuries AD, a late flowering, arriving just before the Picts folded into history. Then in 2018, a team led by Gordon Noble published new dating from Dunacair, a sea-stack fort near Stonehaven, in the journal Antiquity. Symbol-carved stones there had been reused as building material inside a rampart, and the fort was at its height in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, which means the carvings are older still. That pushes the whole tradition back 200 to 300 years, into the shadow of the Roman frontier. These people were not inventing a symbol system in isolation. Long after Rome had left Britain, they were cutting it while Rome was still watching them across a wall. An identity carved into stone, at the exact moment an empire was trying to define them. What the symbols actually say, nobody fully knows. In 2010, a study led by Rob Lee tried to settle it mathematically, borrowing entropy analysis from information theory to argue that the symbols behave like writing. The computational linguist Richard Sproat pushed back hard, arguing that non-random ordering on its own does not demonstrate a script. Catherine Forsyth has spent decades making the case that the symbols are a writing system and that the language behind them was most likely a Brittonic tongue related to Welsh. The leading theory today is that they encode personal names, a carved signature. But the naming theory keeps running into a problem. A handful of symbols, the beast, the crescent and V-rod, the double disc and Z-rod, account for a large share of every example ever recorded. If this is a system for writing down individual people, why is the vocabulary so narrow? Nobody has an answer that satisfies everyone. Even the word Pict may be doing less work than assumed. It appears first in Roman rhetoric, not in anything these people wrote about themselves, and a number of historians read it as a label imposed from outside. On that reading, they were never one tribe at all, but a shifting set of northern British groups, lumped together by an empire that could not tell them apart. The end of that confederation is far better documented than its beginning, and it is not a disappearance. In 839, a Viking army inflicted a catastrophic defeat on Pictish forces and broke the political order. Out of that collapse came Syniad MacAlpine, Kenneth MacAlpin, ruling in the 840s and still styled King of the Picts. It was his grandson Constantine, ruling from 900 to 943, under whom the Kingdom of the Picts became the Kingdom of Alba. Nobody vanished in that transition. The language faded, Gaelic culture took over, and symbol carving, after roughly 6 centuries, stopped. That is absorption, not extinction. A detail the vanished tribe version leaves out every single time. The caves keep insisting something is unaccounted for. A body folded into the shore 8 centuries before Christ. A killing site with a 1,000-year gap between its two uses. A writing system, if it is one, that still will not be read. None of it is finished, and the ground is running out of time. Wemyss has lost more than it has kept. Of the carvings recorded by antiquarians in the 1800s, only about half survive. In 1986, vandals drove a stolen car into Jonathan's Cave and set it alight, destroying a carved swan that had come through 1,000 years of Atlantic weather. That fire is why the Save Wemyss Ancient Cave Society exists at all. A volunteer charity, formed by local people in the weeks after the blaze, still running tours, still fighting the sea, marking 40 years in 2026. Their numbers are blunt. Recording the carvings digitally costs thousands. Real sea defenses would cost £2 to £3 million and may never come. One counselor put it plainly, the scans exist so that at least something survives if the caves are taken. So where does that leave the skull that started this? The isotope results, the tests that will finally say where those Iron Age people grew up and what they ate before they died on this coast, are still working their way through. But the larger verdict is already in. The DNA closed the case on the Scythian myth. The radiocarbon closed the case on how old this shoreline story really is. The wine at Rhynie and the ramparts at Berghead closed the case on the idea that these people were primitive. The Picts were never the exotic vanished race the world was told about for 1,500 years. They were already here, walking this ground, long before Rome ever gave them a name, and their descendants are still walking around Scotland today. Somewhere on that Fife coastline tonight, the tide is still working the cliff edge, pulling sand away from bone, stone away from carving, one storm at a time. A skull that waited 27 centuries to surface did it without warning, and it moved the timeline the moment it broke through. Above it, on the cave wall, the Pictish beast is still staring out of the rock, cut by people who were never as foreign as the label Rome gave them, guarding a threshold that was already ancient long before anyone picked up a blade to mark it. The Picts did not vanish. History just stopped looking in the right place. If you want the next one of these hiding in plain sight, subscribe and tell me. And tell me this. What was a body doing folded into that shoreline in 750 BC, more than 1,000 years before the first Pictish symbol was ever cut into the rock above it?